My name is Andrea Saenz-Williams. For those who I don't know yet, I'm the Director of Education and Civic Engagement here at Rosa. And it is a real treat to have everyone here. Thank you so much. I know there's a lot of Zoom options and it is just fantastic to know that you're all with us tonight. So, with that, I would like to welcome our members and patrons and our volunteers, board members, everyone to the second in DeRosa's previews of the Incorrect Museum vignettes from the DeRosa collection. And I think I speak for everyone in the DeRosa family when I say that we are thrilled to let you know that we are officially opening the exhibition on April 17. Woo! And I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Kate. This is the second, as I said, of 3 previews of the exhibition. If you missed the first one, a link has gone around to all of the invitees from this, and it will be posted publicly on our website soon. And this one is being recorded as well. And all 3 are led by DeRosa's fearless Executive Director, Kate Eilertson, who has organized the show alongside Curatorial Assistant Twyla Ruby. Before we begin, I'll go over some nuts and bolts. We'll start the preview with a curatorial presentation by Kate and Twyla, and we'll end with some time for questions. All in all, we'll spend a quick 45 minutes together. Please jot down any curiosities that come up while Kate and Twyla are talking, or feel free to put them in the chat. I will monitor that as well. And we'll keep you muted during their presentation, and then we'll turn the mute button off so that everyone can just have a convivial Q&A at the very end. As I mentioned, the program is being recorded. Feel free, of course, to keep your video on or off, and then we will be making it available on our website to the general public at a later date. On behalf of everyone here at DeRosa, thank you so much again for joining us. We are really grateful to have your support, and we'd especially like to thank our generous donors and our steadfast board of directors who have helped make this exhibition possible. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Kate and Twyla.
Yay! We're so excited to share our thoughts about the next 2 vignettes, Dude Ranch Dada and Nut Art. But before we begin, we wanted to just kind of remind you who were with us last time, and for the new people, what we mean by the Incorrect Museum and why the heck did we call it the Incorrect Museum. So as many of you know, René de Rosa was so proud of the fact that he had an incorrect museum. In fact, he was so proud that he wrote a sing-along identifying how wonderful that was. He was really proud of promoting the artists from the region who rejected all the commercialization and mainstream art world bull. I won't finish that word. He defied the aesthetic and social conventions of the art world, and he was very proud to reserve a curatorial frown. Of course, that makes us question it a little bit, but moving ahead, he did not like labels, he did not like text panels, he wanted everybody to stand in front of a work of art and have their own personal experience. He did not want to tell you what to see when you looked at something. Twyla, my partner in crime here, is a historian. So she rejects that concept completely. And she wants to, provide the context and the history and the whole thing that goes along with it. So we're kind of striking a middle ground with where we go on this exhibition. I'm a little bit more like René, and Twyla has the more historical piece of it. So maybe you want to go to the slide.
We just wanted to remind everyone that the title of the exhibition was borrowed from this little ditty that René de Rosa himself wrote upon the opening of the preserve to the public in 1997, his sing-along for an incorrect museum. So he's the one who conceived of the de Rosa as an incorrect museum, where visitors were invited to titter and to laugh at the rascality of the artwork. and to reject too much serious ponderosity. So a lot of those values we're going to be talking about tonight as we look at Dude Ranch Dada and Nut Art.
He also wanted everyone to be a free admitter. So as the executive director, not as the curator, I must confess to you that we are not able to do that. We have to charge admission. And we appreciate every dollar that comes in the door.
But visitors are welcome to freely admit their titters.
Okay, good.
So we just wanted to reiterate that the Sing Along for an Incorrect Museum was the inspiration for the title and is sort of our guiding force in this thing.
Guidepost.
Yeah, mission statement.
Yeah. Next slide.
Okay, so we talked a little bit last time about how Peter Seltz attempted to define the sort of unique Bay Area, Northern California style around 1970 as quote unquote funk art in his seminal 1967 exhibition of Bay Area art. And we talked about some of the pros and cons and the sort of the funny afterlife of this term funk art.
We talked a lot about how the artists hated being called funk and did things like threw shoes at Peter Seltz and really reacted against it.
So we came away from last time with the sense that maybe funk art wasn't the best label to apply to the uniquely incorrect style of Bay Area art during this time period. So tonight we're going to look at two other attempts to label or define what was different and unique about Bay Area art as opposed to the art coming out of New York or Los Angeles during that time period. So each of the two vignettes that we're going to look at tonight, Dude Ranch Dada and Nut Art, both involve an attempt to label or define what was unique about Bay Area / Northern California art. And we're going to invite everybody, especially in the Q&A / comments portion, to chime in on whether or not and how they think any of these labels are appropriate or the maybe potential issues with some of them.
Or if we're crazy.
Okay, so
Next
the
slide.
the first vignette we're going to look at is Dude Ranch Dada. Okay, so this phrase, Dude Ranch Dada, was coined by this famous art critic from the New York Times named Hilton Kramer in a 1971 review of an important exhibition by Wiley at the Hanson Fuller Gallery in San Francisco. So Kramer famously described Wiley's style as Dude Ranch Dada. So Kramer believed that Wiley, much like Dadaists like Duchamp and others in the early 20th century, was producing work that was irreverent, humorous, but also at the same time rooted in a kind of left-wing and anti-war politics, and was using humor and irreverence to get across a sort of serious and particularly anti-war message in the aftermath of World War I. Relied a lot on punning and joking, and was ranging across many media and often incorporated literary elements, including poetry and narrative. And but according to Kramer, what was different about Wiley's brand of neo-Dadaism, or this sort of West Coast variant of Dadaism, according to Kramer, was that it incorporated or it appealed to a sort of a Western imagination, or kind of what we have been thinking of as like a Hollywood version of the West. So Kramer wrote about how Wiley would, often incorporate the
10-gallon hat and the cowboy boots. And
well, Wiley himself kind of lived life as a sort of a cowboy figure, and he was kind of an outlaw cowboy artist in the view of Hilton Kramer, and at the same time, the works themselves also appealed to the imagery of the Wild West, or sort of a Hollywood or pop version of the pop Western, as Kramer says there.
So Twyla and I have had several debates about whether Hilton Kramer, who was the god of art criticism in New York for probably 20 years and was the kind of superior voice of everything art world. And my feeling about his essay here, or his report here, is that he was putting down Wiley and this pop Western imagery. Twyla believes he wasn't doing that. So all the docents out there, you should debate that in your next docent seminar.
So anyway, so Kramer coins this phrase Dude Ranch Dada as an attempt to sort of label or define what was unique about the art being produced in Northern California around 1970. So if we go to the next slide. We want to talk a little bit about how it's kind of funny because Kramer's review was really only talking about Wiley's work as quote unquote Dude Ranch Dada. But over the next 10 years or so, the label kind of morphed and ultimately became applied to a wider circle of Wiley's collaborators and confidants. So a lot of people who are familiar with the collection will know that Wiley was really close, particularly to Robert Hudson and William Allan, with whom he grew up in Washington State.
It's amazing they went to the same high school, and they all talk in anything you read about them, how influential their high school art teacher was. Mm-hmm. Same guy.
And then they all studied at the California School of Fine Arts together and were trained as Abex painters, and then sort of spectacularly rejected the abstract expressionist style in the early 60s and adopted this alternative style that kind of retrospectively came to be known as Dude Ranch Dada. All three of them were included in Seltz's Funk exhibition in 1967. So at first they were kind of included in that grouping of funk, but they objected to that label. Wiley was on the infamous panel of at the Funk Art exhibition, and perhaps was the person that threw his shoe at Seltz. So what we want to point out is that even though the Kramer article only described Wiley's work as Dude Ranch Dada, over the next 10 years or so, the work of this larger circle that surrounded Wiley, all of them came to be known as members of this Dude Ranch Dada circle.
And all of them hung out in Wiley's studio in Woodacre. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that studio because I had the great honor of visiting his studio a few years ago. We did an exhibition actually curated by Peter Seltz at the Sonoma Valley Museum. And so I was able to go to Woodacre and barely found my way up this back road to this address on my GPS system that this is where he lived. And I said, where does he live? Got out of the car, saw a staircase that like very steep staircase down a cliff almost, and got to the bottom of the staircase. And there was a footbridge over the creek that was there. Kind of teetered my way across this footbridge. And on the left-hand side was a very small house where it turns out Wiley and his wife lived at the time, and continued up maybe 200 yards to this ramshackle building that wasn't even a barn. It was smaller than a barn. It was like a shed you would have on the side of your house. And I went up to the door that was rotted and the whole thing looked like it was going to fall over. But I stepped inside and there was Wiley with a big, big smile on his face and welcomed me. And I saw on the floor of the studio was one of his banjos. He loved to play banjo. He loved to play the banjo, and you'll see one later in our slides here. But on the wall, a big long wall, the studio was probably 20 feet by 20 feet. And on the big long wall was probably 25 drawings and paintings of different eras and different times, including one he was working on at the moment. I looked down and there was a big old-fashioned radio. And it turns out that he listened to NPR/KQED/KPFA night and day. And this is where, from this public radio station, he got much of his sort of political news, cultural news. I kind of loved that because I drive in the car a lot. And when I drive, I do the same thing. And it's really a great way. But the fact that he did that and incorporated it into his paintings, it was really pretty cool. I wanted to say one more thing before we move on here about Wiley. First of all, he practiced Zen, not as a religion, but as a way of life. And when you look at his objects, when you go into the exhibition, I want you to remember this because it was very important to him, but he never talked about it. He just saw it as a way of life. Alan Watts, in one of the essays that I read about him, explains Wiley's relationship to Zen in a Japanese haiku. a pebble thrown into the pool of the listener's mind, evoking associations out of the richness of his own memory. It invites the listener to participate instead of leaving him dumb with admiration while the poet shows off. That's very, very Wiley. He's, as many of you know, I'm sure some of you know him, but he's not only very Zen, he's a very gentle man and one of the smartest people I've ever known in my life. So that's my groupie thing about Wiley. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so we're really excited about this piece because it's a kind of a time capsule that was created at Wiley's studio in 1970 and is kind of a window into this really fertile, verdant, creative community that was coalescing in his studio at 𝘧𝘪𝘐𝘮. And so we're kind of thinking in this vignette of his studio as kind of the center of like a Dude Ranch Dada salon with all of these collaborators and friends coming together and working and creating art and talking about life and hanging out. So Beatnik Meteor, many of you may be familiar with it from this really cool show that Amy Owens curated a few years ago that was entitled Beatnik Meteor, and it was the centerpiece of this show at the Rosa. But we believe that when it was shown there, it was exhibited in something like the form you see in this picture here, everything inside the box. So we've made a kind of exciting, we think, decision to display all of the components within the box individually. So we're hoping that everybody will get an opportunity to become more intimately acquainted with all of the individual components inside of this time capsule that Wiley created in 1970.
And it's a big range of things, from photographs of Wiley and his family and photographs of Wiley with his friends to the meteor itself.
Right. So the centerpiece of this work is the actual Beatnik Meteor, which was a rusted out circuit board that Wiley found on the creek on his property just outside of the studio. And on the inside of the top of the box, you'll see there a little legend or map that Wiley has drawn to show where exactly on the property he found this Beatnik Meteor or rusted out circuit board. So that was kind of the impetus for this piece. He put this Beatnik Meteor that he encountered, that he found along the shores of his creek, put it into this box, and then decided to add in all of these other cool things that really give a slice of life in his studio circa 1970. So some of the other things, so where there's all these cool original black and white photographs showing Wiley with Hudson and Allan hanging out, jamming on banjos, riding motorcycles, creating art. Also some really cool family photographs of Wiley with his children. There's also a burned out photograph of Richard Nixon inside of a mason jar, which is kind of a fun illustration of Wiley's anti-war politics in 1970. Mm-hmm. Another thing that really resonates for us in the context of the Incorrect Museum is a big Ziploc bag full of dust collected from the floor of the Whitney Museum that was submitted by one of his collaborators and friends.
You want to talk about incorrect.
Yeah, right. And so there's also a ton of works that were created by his collaborators that he also put in there. So it's not only works by Wiley, it's also a documentation of a performance piece by 𝘧𝘳𝘃𝘯𝘬𝘃𝘯𝘬𝘃. Mm-hmm. So just, it's an amazing plethora of material inside of this time capsule that really gives you a glimpse into life in his 𝘧𝘪𝘐𝑒𝑟 studio in 1970, and like sort of the life of this Dude Ranch Dada salon, which is really the heart of this vignette. So we're really excited about that in our curatorial decision to display all of the components so that people can really get to know this piece on a more intimate level.
Okay, next slide. We have to rush through the next couple of slides so we don't go over our time. So this is the banjo that I talked about. I love this piece because inside the banjo, when you see it in the exhibition, there's a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey. Is that right? Whiskey. But it's just, he did several works of art with the banjo, and this is, I think, one of his finest.
And you'll see photographs of him and Wiley, him and Hudson, I believe, playing banjo, sitting around and jamming, playing these instruments. And that really kind of allows you to imagine how they kind of imagined themselves as these Dude Ranch Dada kind of cowboys playing these Western instruments.
Yeah.
Or at least drawing on the imagery and their imagined Western frontier that they were inhabiting.
Next slide.
So this is a much later work by Wiley, which is also included along with several other later works. And here, rather interestingly, you see him moving away from the Dude Ranch imagery. This is this Buster character that occurs in a lot of his later works. And this piece is really more to do with the climate crisis and environmentalism and consumerism. There's all these little messages scribbled in Sharpie all over the masking tape and also the plastic bag that the character is holding. That talk about consumerism and waste and environmental waste. So it's sort of interesting how you can see the evolution of his political interests over the time period.
Yeah. Yeah, which, as Linda says, they are still relevant today.
Mm-hmm.
Even more so today, actually.
So one thing we encourage you to think about is how perhaps did he maybe inch away from this Dude Ranch imagery,
cowboy imagery, and into what you see here
in the decades following 1970.
Okay, next slide. I love this piece. It stares at you when you walk into the gallery. It's like it's live, and it's just like looking at you saying, what the heck are you doing here?
And this piece by Robert Hudson in 1975 seems pretty clearly to be engaged with the Dude Ranch Dada themes. This taxidermy deer is a real taxidermy deer. So it's kind of in the tradition of like a Duchampian ready-made object.
Very Dada.
But also of a Western kind of variant of it. And it's kind of creepy in the gallery, the way it stares at you. So it's maybe sort of a political statement about hunting or something, I don't know. But everyone just loves this one.
Yeah. It uses some of Wiley's imagery, the black and white stripes and the grids down below.
Yeah.
You'll see it.
Right. So you can really see the close collaboration between Hudson and Wiley in this piece.
Yeah. And then the third person in our...
I'm sorry, no.
Oh, sorry. Same thing. Robert forgot. So I included this piece because Jose, who works here at De Rosa and was Renee's dear friend, still with us today, who tells me a story every day, something about Renee. Not all of them able to tell you here tonight, but he did tell me that this piece was Renee's favorite work of art in the collection. So we really wanted to include it in honor of Renee.
And this is Joseph Boyce depicted in the hat there, who is a neo-Dadaist figure. So there again, we see Hudson kind of gesturing towards the Dude Ranch Dada idea.
Yep. Really
self-consciously at this point in kind of a funny way. But Hudson's work, it doesn't seem to me as overtly political as Wiley's. And maybe people want to
argue that
with me.
We're good to argue. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is Bill Allan. Did you have something else you wanted to say there? No, okay. So I think of him more as a poet than as a painter, although he was a really great painter, and there are two large pieces in the show. He practiced magical realism in what he called story painting. So he's telling a story with each of his paintings. And this one, Tentative Assault on Mount Fear, you see up on the left, kind of upper left, you'll see a knife. Believe it or not, the jackknife is there for protection. It's protecting the fish from flying into something that might be dangerous to him. And he himself is a very serious fisherman and loved to fish. And he says this is his tribute to fish. And he's sorry that he killed all the fish that he did. He wanted to justify all the fish that he's killed in his life.
So those three characters are the main ones in our Dude Ranch Dada vignette. So before we move on to the second vignette that we're going to discuss, we just want to pause for a second to pose the question, which we can come back to perhaps at the end. Is Dude Ranch Dada make sense as a label to describe what all three of these guys were doing? In what sense were they participating in a project called Dude Ranch Dada? in what sense maybe did that change over time? And to what extent does Dude Ranch Dada suffice as a label for the entire Northern California style around this time?
Right.
That make, do you have any, what are your, you have some thoughts about that, I think.
I'll save them for the end.
Okay.
Yeah. Nut art, here we go.
Okay.
So,
nut art is is another attempt by another group of people to define the Northern California style. This time, the people doing the defining is not, a New York curator like Peter Seltz or a New York art critic like Hilton Kramer. This time, it's the California artists themselves coming out and saying, no, what we're doing is nut art. So
what is nut art, you may ask? They made a manifesto to help make it clear, but you know what? Reading the manifesto doesn't make it that clear.
No. But the story is that in 1969, shortly after Seltz's exhibition, DeForest and Gilhooly and Bailey had all been included in Seltz's exhibition and were being referred to in the art press as funk artists, and they really took issue with that, and so they got together and decided to christen themselves as nut artists instead of funk artists. So it was a really intentional rejection of the funk label in 1969, and in 1972 they put together this seminal nut art exhibition at Cal State Hayward, curated by Clayton Bailey, and as part of the catalog for that show, DeForest penned this nut art manifesto that became an important founding document for this nut art school. So I encourage you to Google the nut art manifesto because it's just the craziest, most psychedelic piece of writing. It's really fun. But we've tried to pull out a couple of key ideas here in these quotes that we have on the right. So one thing that made it nut art in their eyes was that the artist was a peculiar, eccentric individual constructing a miniature world or a completely fitted out phantasmagoria.
A fantasy world. Mm-hmm.
Another interesting thing is in the second quote down there, you'll see nut art is kernel art or brain art, convoluted, rambling, roundabout. So the word nut works there not only in the sense of like an eccentric artist, like a nutty guy, but it's also meaning like, to the nut of it, like meaning kernel.
To the base.
Well, because what the nut artists were doing was illustrating the sort of kernel of their inner life.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think inner life is the way of understanding this whole group of artists. And maybe the next slide, I think, is the inner life. Yeah, this is the one by Roy DeForest that is probably the most famous work that has been seen around to Rosa. And Twyla, you want to talk about the inner life idea?
Well, DeForest isn't, we're all pretty familiar with DeForest's work, so it's a helpful way to get into this idea of nut art. So we all know that he has these dog characters that recur throughout all of his many different works. So
all of these artists have alter egos, and Roy's was the alter ego was the dog.
Was Doggy Dinsmore. But DeForest was illustrating his inner fantasy world, or sort of the kernel of his brain. And these dog characters and rabbits kind of recur over many, many works that he did in a huge variety of media. So in the show, we have not only paintings and sculptures by DeForest, but also this cool artist book that he did that I don't think has ever been shown before, that we're really excited about showing.
We're really excited about this. This is a whole artist book that he did with maybe 12 pages, and we're able to lay it out on a table so you can see page by page what's in it.
So over the course of decades, DeForest is illustrating his inner fantasy life.
His alter ego too.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about the next slide?
This thing about the alter ego is that all of the artists who were in the Nut Art Show in 1972 and were sort of signees on the Nut Art Manifesto. They all created alter egos for creating their art. So Bailey, for example, famously created art as Dr. Gladstone. So this adoption of an alter ego is another aspect of being a nut artist. And it I think reflects the sort of fantasy like
escape.
Yeah. Okay, so Gilhooly famously has these creates these frogs in all of his works.
He loves frogs. Look at this Mac burger. So it's called,
Frog Big Mac.
Yeah, McDonald's burger made with a frog. I love that.
So frogs are to Gilhooly as dogs are to DeForest. And similarly, both of them are doing this wide-ranging illustration of their inner life over many years with these recurring characters. Similarly, in the next slide, Clayton Bailey has these recurring monstrous characters. We're really excited about
the burping bowl.
We have a little video.
There's a video. Watch it. It actually burps. That was the burp. You can hear it sometimes too. I don't know. We can't hear it.
Took quite a lot of mechanical work to get that going.
Bravo, Hugo. That one.
With the actual piece as well. The narrator
right.
had to do a lot of research to get it burping. So it's interesting, sort of, and maybe another thing we can discuss in the discussion / Q&A session is what are some interesting like points of comparison and contrast between the Dude Ranch Dada and the nut artists, because one interesting point of contrast is that whereas the Dude Ranch Dada guys were more sort of explicitly political and engaged with the exterior world, the nut artists were more inward looking. And another point of contrast to think about is that the Dude Ranch Dada guys were more collaborative, whereas the nut artists are more individualistic in their practices.
That's right. Next slide. I know we're running out on time. We want to have enough time for questions. So I think this is the last slide from the exhibition. I just wanted to talk for a minute about Robert Arneson. I'm sure most of you know about Robert Arneson from his famous portrait of George Moscone. He was amazing because as Twyla's been talking about the funk show all through this program tonight, he was considered the father of the ceramic funk art movement. And he presented a curatorial challenge to us because he could be considered in the funk show, in the Pot Palace, in Dude Ranch Dada, and in the nut art vignette. He goes between all of them.
Because just in a biographical level, Arneson, along with Wiley and DeForest and all of these guys, they were all teaching at Davis at the same time and all running in the same circles, really.
Yeah, right. But I think he's interesting because he did so many self-portraits. So this is a self-portrait, obviously, and we're using this as kind of the logo for the exhibition because he's sticking his tongue out at us. It's very incorrect. Anyway, he used self-portraiture as a means to examine his relationship with the world, expressing serious thought and difficult emotional content through a humorous mask. I think he did that exceptionally well. Probably many of you know that he passed away from cancer, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, something like that. And he went through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering with that, but he continued to use humor as his kind of medicine for how to get through it all. It's a lesson for all of us. But I think he's our last slide here because he does represent an artist that could be found in every vignette that we've talked about. We also wanted to mention tonight that there are so many vignettes in this De Rosa collection. You cannot imagine. They are just kind of popping out all the time for us here in the curatorial department. And we are really hoping we can do more of these.
Yeah, so many stories that could be told using this collection as a resource.
Yeah. Okay, I think the next slide is our show that's going to be in Gallery 1, young people from the Bay Area who use ceramic in very different ways, and you're going to love it. Going kind of obnoxious. I didn't mean that, but you know what I mean. It'll be really interesting. It's meeting Gallery 1, opening the same day, April 17th. 3 Bay Area artists, all who say they were very inspired by some of the artists in this collection.
Mm-hmm. But maybe just before we wrap up, I'd just reiterate that one of the kind of the questions we want to leave you and also the visitors to the exhibition with is how much do we believe in either Dude Ranch Dada or Nut Art as cohesive labels? And does it really describe what all of the people in that circle were doing, or can we pick it apart? And also, do we think that either funk or Dude Ranch Dada or Nut Art are good ways of understanding what was unique about Bay Area art around 1970, or are all of them sort of insufficient? So if people have questions or comments about that, that would be definitely
fun
welcome.
to explore.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
The end.
Andrea, did you get any questions?
No questions, but thank you so much. That was super interesting, and I'd like to invite everyone who would, anyone who'd be interested to just unmute yourself, and you can just offer up a question, or you can put it in the chat, and I'm happy to ask it for you.
See, Linda's asked a question. Why did the artists prefer these titles as opposed to funk art?
I think funk has a negative connotation to it. It's like not serious, shouldn't be taken seriously by the art world, and it's just all over the place and comic rather than serious. And they felt that it was, I think they felt, did you think this, Twyla, an insult to their art?
And also, I think we saw last time that the artists that were included in Seltz's exhibition just felt like it was overly broad, and like they didn't necessarily feel like they were all doing the same thing as each other. So they felt all kind of lumped into one category when they didn't really see themselves as doing, they saw it as being a more diverse, multifaceted set of things going on in the Bay Area than just a singular thing called funk art. Then another thing I would point out is that Nut Art is the only one of these labels that is actually generated by the artists themselves.
Yeah, right.
Dude Ranch Dada is also imposed by this New York art critic. And I think we see that over the course of Wiley's career, certainly he moved away from using this Western Dude Ranch imagery, and he was uncomfortable with being labeled, I think, as Dude Ranch Dada, especially as the years went on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's weird that an East Coast art critic was identifying the West Coast thing when there was such competition going on with them.
And that was also another thing that the people really objected to with the Seltz thing, was that this East Coast MoMA curator would come in and put a label on what people were doing in California. That was really antithetical to their whole ethos of West Coast kind of incorrect anti-art establishment, that a fancy establishment curator would label what they were doing.
Yeah.
This comment from Shelley about so many artists besides Arneson could fit into any of these. I think that's super true. And that's one that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
We talk about that a lot.
Yeah. Where do they belong?
Mm-hmm. And maybe that kind of reflects the idea that all of these labels that were imposed from various places are kind of false or problematic. And so I guess what we want to ask is, so like, how should we understand what was unique about Bay Area / Northern California art?
Yeah.
Because I don't think we really accept any of these labels as really very good.
Yeah.
And so if they do,
well, some of them though help understand a certain moment in time and why they were doing it. I think, they need to be not discounted. But
I think one thing that's come up in our conversations too is that we maybe feel that Nut Art is a more helpful than some of the other ones, more cohesive maybe than Dude Ranch.
That's because they wrote a manifesto explaining it.
But I don't know, like, what do you guys think about whether Dude Ranch Dada really does apply to Wiley, Hudson, and Allan? Like, in what sense is what Allan's doing Dude Ranch Dada? That doesn't really make sense to me.
Oh, I think he was involved in the political and social movements of the time, and he was trying to find a way to express himself differently than other artists.
Mm-hmm. He's not very explicitly engaged with the Dada tradition.
Okay, let's move him into.
But I think Dude Ranch Dada is a problematic label, and especially, I mean, maybe it makes sense if it's just applied to early period of Wiley's career, but it doesn't even apply to later Wiley. And I don't think it applies to the broader circle around Wiley as it's often used.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of an accident of biography that these three, that, you know, Wiley's larger circle is all kind of known as the Dude Ranch Dada circle, when really it was only Wiley's work circa 1970 that's Dude Ranch Dada.
Yeah. Anything else? Andrea, you always have good questions.
I'm waiting for, I'm monitoring the chat, but I would love to hear someone just open it up so that we have some fresh voices. I would like to offer up sorry, no offense, Kate and Twyla.
Yeah, right.
I love your voices.
No problem. You want us to sing the sing-along?
That could be fun. But yeah, does anyone have questions or comments or anything?
Susan Heenis, I do have a question about the painting, Look to the Stars.
Yeah.
And whose face, is that Robert Hudson's face? Or whose face is
That's
that?
the Joseph Boyce face. And he was very active during the Dada period, so it makes sense. You know about Joseph Boyce? I mean,
No, I don't, but I'm.
Thing, but he was an important figure.
Okay.
And I think Hudson just really admired him.
He was like a key like neo-Dada figure in like the 40s and 50s. Sort of one of the first kind of generations after the first generation of Dadaists that were applying this Dada philosophy in the post-war period.
Yeah.
So that seems like a very intentional gesture towards Dadaism.
Okay.
But is it Dude Ranch? I don't think it's very Dude Ranch.
That was going to be my next question. I don't really see how it ties into the other examples of Dude Ranch.
Well, you can blame me for that because I felt so strongly because it was Renee's favorite work that we needed to include it. And we were including his Deer, which is Dude Ranch Dada, in front of it. So,
okay.
And that's the honest answer.
But the vignette is posing the question about like whether Dude Ranch Dada is a good way to understand what they were doing. And
yeah,
I think maybe it's not, is what we come away with.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Reading Dana's comment about, I agree with Dana when she says Dude Ranch was Kramer's way of dismissing the West. I agree. Twyla and I had a big debate about this yesterday, I think it was, because she didn't think so, but I believe that too.
Why? Because Dude Ranch seems like derogatory, to put it that way.
Yeah.
Well, the Dude Ranch doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in what way?
Well,
These guys aren't dudes.
Yeah.
They're
I mean,
very,
you have to
they're
place
highly
it.
individualistic.
You know, I know people are going to
eccentric.
ask me,
Uh-huh.
but I have to admit that I don't even know what Dada means. I know a lot of people are going to ask
Twyla
us.
can give you an answer. I'll help you, Twyla, if you want. She's our historian.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert, so I would encourage everybody to research that for themselves to feel more comfortable with it. But I think it's a art movement that was after World War I that was kind of embraced irrationality and irreverence and humor. And it was
anti-art world.
Yeah.
Anti-art world is what it was. Yeah.
And there were many different offshoots of Dadaism in Europe, but Americans are most familiar with the New York brand of Dadaism, and it's
Marcel Duchamp.
And his
Man
ready-made
Ray.
fountain, the
Right.
urinal,
The urinal.
and his idea of the ready-made is kind of the American brand of Dadaism. And so it's kind of a very broad label for early modernist art movement that was rejecting the values of the art establishment after World War I.
I also think it was very politically charged, the Dada movement. And I think that's the similarity between these artists and the original Dada artists.
And a lot of the Dada artists, I think, felt that like the sort of bourgeois values of the art world and the museum world in 1910s was partly like to blame for what had happened in World War I. So a rejection of the sort of bourgeois art world was hand in hand with the political critique of
And that's so similar to what we're talking about with the Incorrect Museum.
Yeah.
Anti-bourgeois, anti-art market, anti-capitalism.
But I think if you take that one step further, they would probably say anti-label.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Don't
Anti-label.
label us, don't group us,
Right.
don't,
Yeah.
don't
Mhm.
assign.
Don't tell us what to see.
Right, or don't even
feel.
assign my style of work or my intent. Don't even try and label it.
And
Yeah.
that's why they were throwing their shoes at Peter Seltz, I think, at the Funk exhibition.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think that this is more
Hi,
a
Maura.
hi. I think too that Kramer was somewhat desperately trying to relate this to a European tradition. He
Right.
couldn't
Oh.
acknowledge that something sprang out of the West without influences
Mhm.
from the
Mhm.
East Coast or from Europe. I think that was tough for him. I wanted to mention a couple of years ago, I saw an exhibit at SF MoMA, and it was Robert Arneson. It was in
Yeah.
a small room in a circle, and it was at the time that he was dying of cancer, and they were the most anguished.
Mhm.
I still remember it so well. It's in the permanent collection of SF MoMA, I believe, but it was astonishing, the suffering, the anguish
Yeah.
that he portrayed in those last ceramics of his. It was nothing very humorous about it.
Yeah.
I think that the idea that humor and anguish are like two sides of the same coin
Yeah.
is maybe kind of in the Dadaist tradition, and also is really pervasive throughout the DeRosa collection.
Mhm.
The
I think
word
we ran out of
absurdity
time,
comes
Andrea.
to,
Did you? Sorry, go ahead.
I said the word absurdity comes to my mind when we talk about Dada,
Mhm,
because it is that period of time between
mhm.
the wars was a very disturbing
Mhm.
period.
In a
True.
sense that the world was upside down or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Dada is just an expression. I have always read it as an expression of the world turned upside down.
And the senselessness of the world.
Yes.
I think that's-
And therefore, anything can be what you call it.
and therefore, a urinal can be art.
That's right.
Yeah.
Handlebars and a bicycle seat.
Yeah.
And so I think it is right to see that being linked in some way to what these people were doing around 1970, because there was kind of a similar feeling around 1970. I mean, I wasn't around then, but the sort of senselessness of war, and that the world was upside down, and that
Well, it was
these-
right after all the political revolution and
yeah.
But-
you know,
Students.
What Allan and Wiley and Hudson all came from the same environment up in
Washington.
Washington,
Mhm.
and the influence of that teacher that
Yeah. Right.
they had. I don't know much about him, and I don't know much about that history, but it would strike me that there's something there that might speak to their origins.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I've been thinking the last couple of days about how I guess they were near Hanford, Washington, where the a lot of nuclear weaponry was
Oh, yeah.
being produced.
That's where their
Whenever-
parents worked. Their parents all worked there for the federal
Mhm.
government.
Yeah.
By the
So
way,
that's-
Arneson died in '92, so the piece that you had up was done the year before his death. He didn't do real well with chemotherapy. He didn't respond to it very well.
Uh-huh.
Well, I'm
It
gonna
took
be
it
the,
took the humor out of him completely.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I'm gonna be the person that reins on the party and call it, since it's already 6:20 and I want to respect everyone's time. But I think that this conversation shows that there's a lot to talk about with these vignettes, and more good conversations to come. Our next program is April 8th, and that will be the third and the last preview before we open, and you can see everything in person on April 17th. And of course, for all of our docents who have joined us, we'll have more training opportunities to come. So thank you so much. And
Can't wait to see you in the exhibition. Yeah, can't wait to see you there.
Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great
Thank
night.
you.
Great session.
Thanks, Andrea.
Hey.
I learned so much. Thank you.
Good, good.
Thanks.
It's an intimidating crowd because you all know so much about these people.
It was great.
Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.